Justice isn't always found in a courtroom. Sometimes it arrives in a speech no one sees coming. Today's story is about a mother who quietly built a family and a business from the ground up, only to be pushed aside by her own son for the sake of polished words like branding and optics. They wanted to make her a stranger in the very home she had built. And then, at a grand launch event, surrounded by applause for her son, she was handed the microphone. They expected a few words of praise. Instead, she used it to correct the record, armed with the proof she carried in her bag. It all began with a family dinner that seemed perfectly ordinary. I have learned that people do not always recognize the hands that built the table until the plates wobble and the cups spill. Years pass with a quiet rhythm. Bread cut straight, boots lined up to dry by the back door, a roof as steady as a mother's breath at night. Then one day, with the casualness of someone pushing in a chair, they tell you your seat is no longer needed. There's a kind of cold that is not in the air at all, and yet it sinks through wool and bone. I say this not to accuse, but to mark the feeling in a way that does not erase the years that came before. If I sound careful, it is because care once defined me. I am still learning the shape of myself without it. I live in a small town in Ontario where the river runs slow until February, when the ice decides to be river and brittle glass at the same time. Our house stands 2 blocks from the community center, older than most and made of pine and stubbornness. The boards creak where my late husband, Daniel, always meant to hammer another nail. He used to say a house grows around the people who keep it warm. When he died, the house leaned into me, and I learned to keep the furnace filters clean, learned the timing of the sump pump, learned where the shingles lift in a nor'easter. I learned the language of repair. Perhaps that is why I stayed, when others would have sold and driven west to start somewhere easy. It is not that I loved the walls. I loved what they asked of me. And more than that, I loved what they gave back. A place where my son could grow tall and my daughter could collect the kind of quiet that makes a person steady. Mornings are honest here. I wake before the snowplow comes, make oatmeal, and drink my first coffee at the kitchen sink because the window looks east. The old radio on the counter hisses the weather in a voice that hasn't changed in 30 years. The roads slick, the highway closed near the ridge, school buses delayed an hour. I listen like it's news from another country because I no longer need the schedule to tell me what to do. The house tells me. It tells me when the hydrant out front is half buried and I should shovel around it in case the neighbors need it. It tells me when the draft along the baseboards means I should roll a towel and tuck it under the door. It tells me stories through the smell of toast and the dry tick of the baseboard heaters. People think solitude is loud, like a bell. But mine is a low hum. On that particular Sunday, the one I have to start with, though I would rather begin somewhere softer, the town had that after-storm brightness where the sky seems too big for the roofs. Ethan had phoned earlier in the week and said they wanted to host a family dinner to celebrate their promotion at the firm. "It'll be fun," he said, as if the word had a place in our family like a well-worn chair. He asked if I could bring the old cedar salad bowl, the one I used for birthdays and graduations, and the first time he brought a girl home. He said old with affection, or maybe habit. I chose to hear affection. It is a mother's right to choose. I dressed plainly, as I always do. A charcoal sweater I'd mended at the elbow last March, a wool skirt, boots with salt lines from last winter. On my way out, I fastened my coat slowly at the mirror by the stairs and noticed that my hair has finally gone the color of frost along the riverbank. There was a time I would have dyed it, blindsided by the idea that youth might keep my children near. Age, it turns out, is not the thing that loosens your grip. Indifference is. I placed the cedar bowl in a canvas tote, wrapped in a clean tea towel, and stepped into the afternoon. Ethan and his wife live in a newer subdivision across town where the driveways are wide and the porches have the same cheerful railings, painted in different shades, as if color alone could breed variety. Their house smells of lemon and good intentions. She is careful with it, and I respect that. When I arrive, I knock even though I could let myself in. The door opens to warmth and light, and they both say my name. There is a moment, a small one, bright and slippery, where it feels like arriving used to feel. Someone takes the bowl, someone hangs my coat. I stand in the kitchen watching the way their knives move through herbs like they are cutting a green, waking forest. Ethan presses a glass of water into my hand. "We're doing something new," he says, and there is pride in his voice I wish I could wrap like a scarf. "We wanted to talk with you about how we organize things. Family stuff. It'll make life easier for everyone." I nod, and he smiles in relief. The relief unsettles me. When my children were little, their relief always meant I had taken something heavy from them. Now it means they are about to take something from me. The table is set so neatly it feels like a test. Napkins folded clean as hospital corners. The cedar bowl at the center, a low crown of green leaves waiting. We sit. There is bread. There is laughter. There is that new kind of silence that looks like listening but isn't. His wife, who is polite in the way people are when they first move an old fence and hope the neighbors won't mind, clears her throat. "We made a spreadsheet," she says, and shows me her phone, "just to keep track of roles. Who handles what? Expectations." I want to say that a family is not a spreadsheet, but then I remember how many lists I made when I was their age. Grocery lists, budget lists, lists of repairs, of promises, of gratitude. Sometimes we lean on lists when we are afraid we will drop the whole thing. I do not reach for a fight. I have never learned how to do that without breaking something we will later need. Ethan speaks gently at first, clearing space the way he did as a child when he tugged all the chairs into a fort and asked us to climb inside. "Mom, we've been thinking. With the company growing, we're going to have more events, more people over. We want to define our boundaries. You've done so much for us, and we're grateful. But we think it's time to... we want to run our household without you feeling like you have to step in. And there are other things, too. The family business. Just the optics, really. Clients can misunderstand dynamics, and we want to present as independent." It is the word optics that lands like a small stone in my drinking glass. It sits there, clear as anything, and the water tastes of it. I do not speak right away. I have learned that silence in the right length can make another person hear his own voice. But his voice keeps going, picking up speed across ice too thin to hold him. He says I sometimes make decisions, that I offer to host, that people assume I am still the primary contact for certain accounts because my name is on older documents. He says they need to draw clean lines now. He says it is about growth. He says it is not personal. His wife adds, "We want you to feel like a guest, to be able to come and enjoy, then leave without any burden. It's healthier." She smiles as if she has offered me a beautiful holiday. My hands are steady on the napkin, though my chest has a strange, hollow drumbeat in it. These are new words for old changes. Guests do not bring cedar bowls that have been at every table since a man with rough hands carved them as a wedding gift. Guests do not shovel the little path from the sidewalk to the hydrant before breakfast. Guests do not wire the first $5,000 into a business account when the bank manager says he needs collateral. Guests do not carry, in their shoulder and spine, the knowledge of which joist bends if you jump from the third stair. I look at my son, whose hair fell into his eyes when he was 6, who carried a backpack too heavy for his ribs at 12, who cried at 16 when he dented the Honda and couldn't afford the repairs. He does not look away. If I had been different, perhaps this is where I would have stood up and demanded a reckoning. Maybe I would have named the things I had given and asked for the small return. That is respect. But my anger, when it comes, is not the kind that shouts. It is the kind that weathers. I breathe. I look down at my plate and rearrange the crumbs into a straight line. When I was 7, I learned that making a line out of crumbs can fool your stomach. I am not hungry anymore. They explain the details. There will be a public update on the company site. They will shift responsibilities. My name will no longer appear in certain places because, as Ethan says carefully, It's just simpler if people think the company began with us, from a branding perspective. He speaks the words as if they were a gentle snowfall and not the slow erasure of a season. I am troubled by the fact that he believes the two can be the same. The way people make a story out of convenience and then call it truth has always frightened me more than a storm. I ask small questions. Will I still manage the old accounts until they transition? Of course, they say, until the end of the quarter. Will the house, my house, still be used for the holidays if we keep the guest list small? They exchange a look I wish I had not seen. We were thinking we might host, she says. It's just that our place is more accessible for everyone. I nod. I do not say that accessibility is a kind word covering a harder one. Distance. Or perhaps control. Dessert is a tart with a gloss like honest glass. They serve me a slice that leans on the plate. The crust flakes under the tines of my fork, precise and polite. We talk about the weather. We talk about a neighbor's new dog that can catch a frisbee. We talk about the grocery prices and shake our heads as if the shaking might press them back down. The everyday words form a bridge that carries us over the canyon we have just discovered between us. And then we are on the other side, waving as if nothing happened. Before I leave, I wash the cedar bowl by hand, out of habit. I feel the grooves where countless meals have left their quiet oil. You can keep it here, my son offers, so you don't have to carry it back and forth. His voice is kind. It is a kind that no longer knows me. Thank you, I say, and wrap the bowl in the tea towel anyway. I am old enough to know that objects remember the way we hold them. I will not teach this one a new home. Outside, the air is a rinsed blue. Snow squeaks under my boots the way it does when the temperature dips well below freezing. My breath comes out in small clouds that drift and vanish. I pass the row of houses where every porch light has the same brass trim. Every mailbox the same cheerful red flag. A boy on a scooter stops and stares at me, not unkindly. The wind pushes my scarf against my lips, and in the muffled quiet I hear the words again. Guest, boundaries, optics, branding. Words that make a family sound like a meeting, sound like a client. I wonder when language learned to push people to the edges and call it love. At home, the house meets me with the smell of old wood and the faint iron of the radiator. I set the cedar bowl on the counter and fill the kettle. The small answer I give to almost every problem. Boil water. Pour it where it is needed. Tea has seen me through more storms than any sturdy plan. While the water hums, I open the back door and look out at the yard. The snow is untouched except for the slender track of a rabbit that believes fences are suggestions. The lilac bush hunches under its white hood, patient. All winter, it pretends to be nothing. In spring, it will pretend it never pretended. I sit at the kitchen table with my mug and try to name what hurts. It is not just pride. Pride is flashy, a terrible jacket in the wrong size. This is quieter. It is the grief of seeing my work turned invisible, the way a window is noticed only when it breaks. And it is a certain fear that I have raised a son to be successful at the cost of remembering the ground that held him up. When he was small, he used to fall asleep in the car, and I would carry him inside. Do you know how heavy a sleeping child can be? Heavier than a man who can say, branding perspective, without wincing. But then I also remember this. I was the one who told him to chase the life he wanted. I taught him to run without asking who stood at the starting line. Perhaps he has learned too well. I swallow the taste of blame and look for something more useful. On the windowsill sits a small metal tin with a dent in the lid. Inside are receipts old enough to be artifacts. The lumberyard invoice for the back deck, a typed note from the lawyer who helped me navigate the company's first contract after Daniel died, faded copies of the insurance policy I kept paying when paying anything felt like a triumph. There's a certain order to my history that no one else needs to notice for it to be real. I sort through the papers, not because I am planning anything, but because holding them reminds me that I am not the ghost my son is trying kindly to make me into. I find the original incorporation certificate with my name spelled properly and the ink pressed into the paper where someone pressed too hard with a pen. It is not a weapon. It is a record of waking up every morning and doing what had to be done when there was no applause and no promise of ease. Dusk comes in a wide sash. The house grows quiet in that specific way old houses do, where every sound means something. Water settling in the pipes, a branch tipping snow off itself, the furnace shifting as it decides to hum again. I think of the many evenings I spent here alone while the kids chased their lives, how I waited for the garage light to swing across the snow, for their voices, their wet boots tossed in piles by the mat. There is no pile now, only the clean line where I swept this morning. I am not sad about the clean line. I am sad about the way it feels like a verdict. It is almost dark when a car slows in front of the house and then moves on. The headlights glance across the front room and slide away. I turn off the lamp and, for a moment, let the dim hold me. I try to remember the exact tone in Ethan's voice at the table and whether there was any old music in it, the kind from his childhood. My mind replaces it with another memory, the sound he made the first time he rode a bike without me holding the seat. That sound was a small, startled victory, the birth of distance. Even then, I knew my job was to cheer. I also knew to run beside him as long as I could. When I finally stand, I put the papers back in the tin and set it in the cupboard above the fridge. The cedar bowl sits in the center of the table, where the light catches the ridge that runs along its rim. I brush my fingers over that ridge. I do not make any vows. I do not rehearse speeches. I do what I have always done when the ground shifts under me. I make a list in my head. Not a list of what they owe me, because debts turn people into accountants, and I am tired of accounting. I make a list of what is mine to keep. The house humming, the smell of the lilacs in June, the original keys on their heavy ring, the knowledge of where the breaker is, the wordless catalog of every winter we survived, the receipts like breadcrumbs through a forest I once entered without a map. I set my mug in the sink. I fasten the chain on the door. I stand in the quiet until it feels like companionship again. If this were a tidy story, it would end with righteous anger. Life here is not tidy. Snow piles against the porch, whether you invite it or not. People you love learn new ways to talk about you, ways that keep them clean and you out of frame. I cannot make my son see the architecture behind his life all at once, but I know the shape of structures. Some are built to bear weight, some are built to look good from the road. When I finally climb the stairs to bed, I pause on the landing and listen to the old pine breathe. I think of the tin in the cupboard, the papers inside like quiet witnesses who never learned how to leave. I think of the bowl, the groove my thumb knows without looking. Morning will come, and with it, work as humble as a floor that needs sweeping. And beyond morning, somewhere past the tidy talk and the careful smiles, is a broader ache that asks for more than a nod and a folded napkin. I do not know yet what I will do, but I know this. My life did not begin as a supporting detail in someone else's version of events. It began here, with the same hands I will use tomorrow to salt the steps and check the window latch. When the kettle boils in the morning and the light lays itself across the table, I will sit where I always sit. From there, a person can see what holds and what only pretends to. From there, you can decide which stories still deserve the warmth you make. There is a kind of quiet that follows an insult. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of a road after the plow has passed. Edges thrown up, ruts left, a path suggested but not smoothed. You learn to place your boots where the footing holds. You learn that dignity, if it is to last, is not a shout, but a steadying of the hand that turns the knob, that opens the next door, that sorts what remains. I do not say this to sound noble. I say it because after the dinner at Ethan's house, the hours did not immediately fill with rage or with tears. They filled with chores which have their own mercy. A floor that needs mopping does not care about optics. A bill that comes in the mail does not know about branding. Work keeps the day from tipping into a kind of softness I cannot afford. The Monday after, the cold was honest enough to sting. I salted the steps and chipped the ice along the edge of the porch with the old spade. I brushed snow off the hydrant again, because if there is one thing I will not compromise, it is the habit of making room for rescue. I carried the tin of receipts down to the kitchen table and opened it the way you open a hymn book, without drama, expecting to find what you already know by heart. The papers inside had the smell of old ink and dust. I laid them out by type: incorporation documents, insurance policies, bank statements, invoices from the year I had the roof redone with money that should have gone to a holiday. I found the share certificates, the original ones, printed in a font that believed the future would be sturdy. My name is there, not as decoration, but as the person who signed the first check when the bank manager suggested caution. No one bought our beginnings for us. We paid in coin and hours and the kind of worry that lasts in a person's shoulders for years afterward. I made a second pile. Proof of what they call, in meetings, sweat equity. Receipts from the lumberyard, handwritten, the ink feathered at the edges, notes from clients who started with us when the world still sent things by fax. The ledger from the winter, I kept 2 sets of books, not to hide anything but to understand day by day how close we were to the edge. There are also the papers other people might dismiss: the first business number registration, the receipt for the postage meter, the deed transfer after Daniel died. A life leaves a paper echo, and I wanted to hear it clearly. By mid-morning, the kettle had boiled twice. I called my lawyer, who is younger than me by decades and has the name of a person who could be anyone's neighbor. We have spoken over the years about straightforward matters: renewing the will, signing off on small changes when the company grew, registering a second trade name. I have no appetite for arguments that can be avoided by early clarity. He answered on the second ring, and when I asked to come in, he found me a spot that afternoon. I'm not a frequent client, but I am a prompt one. In small towns, that counts. Before I went, I walked through the house the way you might walk through a field after a storm, noting what stood and what needed tending. My eye found what it always finds: a nail popped, a bit of paint flaking near the back door, a draft that has made a friend of the hall rug. I checked the breaker panel as if someone had asked me to recite a poem, and the lines of it steadied me. I pulled the box of documents down from the cupboard over the fridge, added the tin to it, and secured the lid with a strap. Then I put on the boots with the better tread, the ones with laces stiff from last year's salt. At the lawyer's office, the receptionist has a voice like a classroom. Gentle, but not to be argued with. She offered me tea that tasted of mint and meetings. The waiting area looks out over Main Street, where the snowplow had left a clean ridge beside the parking meters. People moved carefully, carrying their lives in grocery bags and glove compartments. When he called me in, the lawyer shook my hand with the care of someone who knows hands are tools and history both. We did not talk about family first. We talked about documents because documents are what the law understands. I set the box and the tin on his desk and told him I wanted to review ownership and authority. The company's original articles still list me as a director and majority shareholder. Over the years, we added Ethan as an officer and later, as a minority shareholder, a change I agreed to when he came back from university with plans and not just theories. The irony that I opened the door that he now wants to call his did not interest me in that moment as much as the structural facts. He reviewed what I laid down and asked the questions a good lawyer asks. Do you intend to remain a director? Do you wish to alter signing authority? Are there assets currently in your name you wish to continue to carry? How would you like to structure your will so that the transition after your death does what you actually want and not just what looks tidy from the outside? I told him I wished to do the following things, not from spite, but from the wish to keep the story honest. To remove Ethan as a signatory on my personal accounts, to require 2 directors' signatures for any major company decision, including asset sales and rebranding, to draft a notice clarifying that I am the founder and that any public materials that erase original ownership will be considered a misrepresentation, to revise my will, making clear what happens to the house and to my shares should I die. It felt odd to talk about my death while the radiator hissed and the city workers outside knocked ice off a stop sign. But if I have learned anything, it is this: grief isn't only what follows a death. Sometimes it is what follows a dinner. He looked at me as if measuring what in me might change my mind later. "You're certain?" he asked, not unkindly. I said I was, and added that certainty and affection are allowed to exist side by side for a time. He nodded and began to draft. The printer worked with the patient rhythm of an old dog breathing. We created resolutions to present at a directors' meeting. We set a date and prepared the notice, which I would deliver by registered mail. He suggested I also email it so no one could claim surprise. He prepared a simple document revoking Ethan's power of attorney, which I had given him in a year when I feared my heart would not keep pace with the day, and a new one naming a friend from church who has known me longer than any brand could. On my way home, I stopped at the bank. There is a sameness to banks. The carpet that tries to look like it is not carpet, the potted plant that seems to be doing well under the lights, the kindly pen chained to the counter. I met with the manager who remembered the day I first came in with my husband's death certificate and asked, in a voice that shook, how one keeps a thing standing without the person who built it. She was softer with me than a banker needs to be. We reviewed my accounts. I removed Ethan's name from any I own outright. I updated the beneficiary designations that, for too long, I had left on a default I never quite trusted. I made a list of invoices that still went through my personal email so I could redirect them. In the end, the manager leaned forward and said, "This is smart." I did not feel smart. I felt like a person taking her name down off a wall she had painted, anticipating how someone else would wallpaper over it in something bright and washable. Back home, I opened the freezer and took out the soup I had made in October when the tomatoes were cheap. The house was quiet, as always, but it was a friendly quiet. After I ate, I sat at the table and wrote a different kind of list. I wrote down what I had given, not so I could throw it in anyone's face, but so I could see myself plainly. The year I sold my wedding ring to pay tuition, the spring I worked 2 jobs, one at the front desk of the motel on the highway, one folding uniforms at the laundromat, coming home with the smell of bleach in my hair. The time I drove west to pick Ethan up when he had gone as far as his pride could take him, then turned around and drove the whole way back while he slept. The winter, the pipes burst, and I and a friend from the next street over patched things at 2 a.m, because waiting for a plumber would have meant losing the kitchen. The Sundays I stayed late at the office to reconcile accounts so our supplier would release the lumber for Monday's order. Nothing I wrote would astonish anyone who has raised kids and kept a house and kept a business from tipping. But on paper, it looked like a map. Choices marked in the small ink of a person who doesn't expect applause. In the days that followed, I kept to my patterns. I shoveled. I replaced the hinge on the cupboard door that had developed a small complaint. I cleared a path to the lilac even though it will not bloom for months. A neighbor stopped by with a bag of oranges. Her sister sends them from out east every year. And we stood shoulder to jam, discussing the odds of an early thaw. I do not think this kind of talk is small. It stitches people to their days in a way that keeps them from slipping. Then came a small thing that was not small at all. A post on the company's social page, a photograph of Ethan and his wife in front of a glossy banner that said, "Founded by Ethan Bennett," with the year that suited them. I stared at it. The way you stare at a mistake in a recipe after the cake has already risen and fallen. The banner was crisp, the light flattering. The lie was not. I did not call him. I took a screenshot. The world now requires proof of what vanishes in a few swipes, and I printed it. I placed it with the other proofs of the way a story can be walked away from when it asks for too much humility. The next day, I visited the accountant who has filed our returns since the business had a single ledger and a tin for petty cash. He speaks gently, as if numbers might bruise if you drop them. We reviewed the company's books. The growth is real. I will not pretend otherwise. Ethan has done well building a client list in sectors I would not have known how to approach, but the foundation is there, the thing that allowed him to build. The accountant showed me what I already knew. My equity is not love that can be uninvited. It is paper and signatures and money paid in, returns reinvested, debts shouldered and cleared. We confirm that any changes to ownership must be approved by the directors and recorded properly. He prepared a letter summarizing this, just in case memory proved weak in the face of convenience. Small-town news has a way of tapping you on the shoulder when you least expect it. The woman at the post office mentioned, while she weighed a parcel, that she had heard my son's wife was planning a launch, a celebration of the company's new facility. I knew about the expansion. I did not know about the event. It is not that I want the invitation. It is that the absence speaks. The date they chose happens to be 2 days after the directors' meeting. There is a part of me that flinched at the timing and a larger part that straightened. If the world insists on placing events side by side, perhaps they will illuminate each other. I will not pretend I wasn't afraid of what the evening might bring. Not of conflict, exactly. Of misrecognition. Of standing in a room where people I had known for years would look through me toward the bar or the banner and believe the version that was easier to swallow. But fear, like ice, can be managed if you know its thickness. You test it with your weight and with your memory. You test it by remembering where the river runs slowest and where the current tricks you into trusting it. I wish I could say the days passed without small cruelties. They did not. An email arrived from Ethan with a tone so professional it could have been sent to a stranger. Going forward, please direct all external inquiries to me or my assistant. He thanked me for understanding. I drafted a polite reply that attached the notice of meeting and the relevant sections of our articles. I did not add a single sentence that could be mistaken for pleading. When I hit send, my hand shook only a little. Later, I sat at the kitchen table and sliced an apple, watching the knife move through flesh to core and wondering when, exactly, the sweet gives way to the hard center. The answer, of course, is that it varies, tree to tree, year to year. On Saturday, I met with a friend who runs the registry office. She came over with a stack of forms and a pen that does not smudge in the cold. We checked title documents for the house to ensure no encumbrances had found their way onto the record without my noticing. Identity theft is not likely here, but likely is a word for gamblers, and I have gambled enough on people. The house is mine, clean as snowfall. We printed a copy of the title and slid it into a folder by itself. I am not frightened of losing the house. I am simply a person who respects the way paper speaks when the room is too loud for voices. On Sunday at church, I sat behind the same family as always, their youngest tracing circles on the bench with his mitten. The minister read from a passage that spoke of building on rock, not sand. It is almost a cliché, but clichés have their uses. They remind you of the obvious at the moment you might forget. After the service, there was coffee in the basement and a plate of squares beside a bowl of clementines. A woman I have known since before my children were born squeezed my arm and said, "You look steady." I said, "I am practicing." The morning of the directors' meeting, I woke before the alarm. I put the kettle on and laid out the papers in the precise order the lawyer taught me. Agenda, resolutions, background documents, copies for each participant. I packed them in a canvas bag with a firm bottom. I wore the coat that fits over a sweater without binding at the shoulders, and shoes with soles that will not slip on the community center floor. The room I had booked has a window that looks out over the rink. The little ones were practicing their turns, each in a helmet that made them look both braver and more breakable. The caretaker had set up a long table and a small pot of artificial greenery, as if believing in spring might help the meeting go better. Ethan arrived with his wife, both of them in good coats, faces bright with the winter air and a kind of adult determination I recognized from my own younger years. He shook my hand in the way men learn to shake hands when they have been told it matters. We sat. I called the meeting to order. It is a plain phrase, not ceremonial, and yet it shifts the air. I moved that we adopt the resolutions. He read them, and his jaw made the small movement a person's jaw makes when he chooses to swallow dignity rather than choke on it. He objected to the wording that named me founder. I read aloud from the incorporation documents, not with triumph, but with the tone one uses to recite a family recipe when a younger person insists parsley belongs in everything. It was not a fight in the way people think of fights. It was a room with fluorescent lights and a heater that clanked every time someone shifted in his chair. It was the sound of pen on paper, of a resolution passing with a recorded vote. It was the small relief of a signature where a signature belongs. I did not look for apology in their faces. I looked for comprehension. I am not sure I found it. But the facts now live in a folder that will speak if ever they are needed to. After the meeting, there was an awkwardness that reminded me of the time I caught a glass just before it hit the floor. A flurry, a pause. Then everyone pretending they never knocked it in the first place. We stood, and there was talk of the weather and of the good donuts at the place by the river. His wife said they hoped the event later in the week would be nice. I said I hoped their suppliers made delivery on time. Supply chains are temperamental in winter. We parted at the door like neighbors do, with too much space between shoulders to call it intimacy. That evening, I returned home and did what some people would call small, but what, to me, feels like calibration. I took the spare key from under the chipped flower pot on the porch and brought it inside. I updated the contact list on the fridge, adding the lawyer's number in neat block print. I checked the smoke detector and changed the battery that still had life left, because the sound of a detector peeping in the night is one of the few things I cannot abide. I ironed a blouse I rarely wear and hung it behind the door, ready in case I needed to look official in a hurry. I ate leftovers standing at the counter because the kitchen has always been both a workshop and a sanctuary. Then I opened my notebook and wrote, at the top of a page, the word terms. Under it, I wrote what I would and would not do. I would honor what was fair. I would not suffer revisionist history in any room where I still had breath. I would offer help when asked in a way that preserved my self-respect. I would not subsidize unkindness. I would attend the event at the new facility if invited, not to make a scene, but because I built the ground those lights will shine on, and I wanted to see whether my hands still recognized the grain of that wood. I would not stand behind any banner that erased me, no matter how pretty the font. 2 nights later, an envelope slid under my door. No one knocks anymore when they are ashamed to be kind. I picked it up and recognized my son's handwriting, altered now by a wrist that writes more emails than letters. Inside was a formal invitation to the launch. Thick cardstock, embossed letters, the kind of expensive you justify by calling it marketing. There was a note, short as breath. We'd like you to be there. Let's keep things professional and positive. It means a lot. Professional and positive. I put the invitation on the table and stared at the words until they separated from their tone and became only what they are. Requests for behavior that does not embarrass. It took me longer than I care to admit to decide. I laid the invitation beside the incorporation certificate. The paper nearly matched in weight. That felt like a kind of omen. In the days before the event, small proofs kept arriving that I was right to move carefully. A supplier forwarded me an email thread where my role had been rewritten as informal support. A client I had known for 15 years wrote to say they were surprised not to see my name on a press release and asked whether I had retired. I wrote back to each with clarity and restraint, attaching only what needed attaching, correcting only what required correction. I did not vent to anyone except the tea kettle, which can take it. On the morning of the launch, the town wore its most impressive winter sunlight, the kind that makes even salt stains look deliberate. I put on the ironed blouse and a dark skirt and boots that shine when you buff them with a cloth. I fastened my coat, checked that the envelopes in my bag were in order, the notice of resolutions in case someone claimed not to know, a copy of the photograph with the false founding date, and a letter I had written and sealed, addressed to myself, to be opened only if I forgot how to behave on purpose. The letter said in the simplest words I could manage, "Remember yourself." When I stepped out onto the porch, the sky had begun to soften in the way it does just before the first guests arrive anywhere. I locked the door and slid the key into my pocket. The air was sharp, honest. The plow had left the road passable. Somewhere in the distance, a dog shook itself free of snow. I stood for a moment and looked toward Main Street where the lights at the community center would be coming on. There is a difference between a house and a home, just as there is a difference between a name on a document and a name on a tongue. If I have done anything right, it is that I have tended both. Tonight, another sort of tending would be asked of me. I did not plot speeches as I walked. I recited instead the list I had written in my notebook. What is mine to keep? The river, the smell of lilac, the original keys, the breaker's location, the steadiness that comes from not lying to myself even when others are tempted by prettier stories. A person cannot carry a whole house on her back, but she can carry a blueprint in her mind and a deed in her bag. What comes next will require a different kind of quiet. The quiet inside a room when a person speaks in her own voice and calls a thing by its name. I have learned the names of beams and joists, of invoices and contracts. I have learned the names of disappointments and their habits. I have also learned the names of repairs that last. There will be a room with music and light and glasses that clink against each other. There will be the people who know and the people who guess and the people who look for the nearest coat rack when anything gets heavy. I will stand where I must stand, and when I lift my head, I will not ask permission to remember out loud. Some truths once spoken do not require permission to stay. Endings don't arrive all at once. They accumulate, like ice along the riverbank, crystal by crystal, until one morning you see the shape and realize it has been forming the whole time. If there is any mercy in an ending, it is that you have a chance, if you pay attention, to choose the surface where you will stand when it comes. I chose a concrete floor under bright lights, a room that smelled faintly of fresh paint and coffee, and a crowd of faces I had once known without needing to think about their names. The launch was set for a Thursday, the kind of Thursday winter enjoys, clear, cold, and honest enough to show every footprint you make between the car and the door. The new facility sits on the edge of town where warehouses squat and face the wind without ceremony. Someone had strung a line of warm bulbs across the ceiling, their light sweetening the concrete like a good glaze on a plain cake. Fold-out chairs were lined in straight rows, a podium in front, the inevitable banner behind. The company name in a font chosen for its cleanliness, the words "A New Chapter" arched above. On a screen near the back, a slideshow cycled through photographs of clean-cut teams and polished surfaces. In some frames, if you knew where to look, there were the bones of the older place. The shelving unit we bought with a check that almost bounced, the hand truck that left a notch in my shin the year the shipment came late, a scar of old paint under the new gray. I stood near the door for a while, coat open, taking the measure of the room the way a person does with her eyes when she has already taken its measure on paper. People arrived in good boots and better coats. The mayor's assistant hovered with a notepad. A supplier I'd known for 20 years waved across the aisle and made his way over, hands already extended. "Clara," he said, the way a person says a familiar street name, "good to see you." We talked about the weather, the roads, whether the highway would hold through the night. His voice tilted when he asked how I was, and I tilted mine to meet it. "Steady," I said, because the word was true and enough. Ethan moved through the room the way a host does when he wants to be seen as a leader. Handshakes, quick nods, the brief lean in that reads as attention. He wore a suit that fit his new life. His wife carried a clipboard and a smile that suggested she had taught herself how to keep a room neat, even when the people inside would not cooperate. When he reached me, he kissed my cheek the way a son does at Christmas. "Thanks for coming," he said. And I said, "Of course," because I had always come when needed, and today I needed to be here as much as anyone. The program began with the usual acknowledgments: fire code capacity, parking reminders, coffee and something sweet at the back. A local counselor said a few words about growth and grit. A friend of Ethan's from the chamber read from a page that named the company as an example of what small towns can do when they refuse to shrink. The microphone squeaked once and then settled. Before the slideshow, Ethan took the podium. He is good at speaking. I will not pretend otherwise. He's always been able to stack the blocks of a story so they form something smooth to the eye. He talked about late nights and early mornings, about calling on clients in bad weather, about believing a thing into being. He said the kind of sentences people like to applaud because they can imagine themselves in them. There was pride in every word, and I let the pride have its space. Pride has a place, as long as it doesn't borrow other people's receipts. When the screen behind him flashed to a slide that read, "Founded by Ethan Bennett," I felt a small click inside, not of surprise. It is difficult to be surprised by what you have already printed and placed in a folder in your bag, but of recognition. There are moments when your body knows exactly what to do because you have spent a life practicing steadiness for lesser storms. He opened the floor for a few remarks from special people who made this possible. The list was prepared. I knew that by the way the MC checked a card and glanced toward the front row. A banker said something about prudence and partnership. A supplier thanked the team for paying on time. A young employee told a brief story about being hired when other doors had shut. Then the MC, who had seen me come in and who, in another part of his life, sings bass in the church choir, turned toward me with a small, careful smile. "Clara," he said, and the microphone found my name the way it finds the person who has stood where the sound is supposed to carry. "Would you like to say a few words?" It is a generous thing to be offered a microphone. It is also a risk if the person offering has forgotten where the story began. I walked up in the shoes I had polished the evening before, the leather catching the light in a way that felt like a small private nod to my past self. I rested my hand on the lectern so the tremor that visits me when the room is too warm would have some place to go. I did not look at my son first. I looked at the room. "Thank you," I said, and my voice sounded like it has on 100 days when clarity mattered. Strong, nothing fancy. I'll be brief. The room relaxed at the promise, and I let it. Brevity is a kindness in public. It sharpens a point. I have lived in this town long enough to know that new paint is a real joy. I began. Fresh floors, organized shelves, good lights. A person can do better work in a place that has been set to rights. I am happy for this building and for the people who will work here. Many of you have known our company since it was a desk in a rented room above the hardware store and a plastic file box under my bed. Many of you saw us through when there was more month left than money. You extended terms. You took our calls on Sundays. When Daniel died, you put casseroles by the back door, and then, when the food was gone, you put business in our hands. For that, I am grateful beyond any sentence I can make tonight. I watched the faces soften, the recognition moving across them like a tide. People remember kindnesses they gave almost as gladly as the ones they received. It makes them who they say they are. "There's a detail I need to correct," I said. Not to embarrass anyone, but to keep the record square. The screen behind me says, "Founded by Ethan Bennett." Ethan has done good work, that's a fact. Another fact is this. The company was founded by me, Clara Bennett, in the year printed on the incorporation document I am holding. I lifted the folder just enough that those in the front row could see the edge of the paper. I was not dramatic. I was specific. I filed the first papers, signed the first checks, took the first risk against my own house. Over the years, I invited Ethan in. I am glad I did, but it is not true that the company began with him. It began with me. No one gasped. This is not television, but there was a shift, like the one that happens when you step from ice to ground and your ankles understand the difference before your mind does. Someone coughed softly. A chair creaked. The MC adjusted his card and then pretended he had always meant to adjust it. I continued. Last week, our board met. We passed resolutions to make our structure as sound on paper as it has always been in work. Nothing revolutionary, just clean. 2 signatures are now required for major decisions, including any change to branding that would misrepresent origins. We have notified the bank and our accountant. We will issue a public correction about the founding, and we will ask our partners to update their materials. This is not a scolding. It is an alignment. When a shelf lists, you do not blame the cans. You level the bracket. I spoke for another moment about continuity, about wanting the business to thrive into a future where my name matters less than the integrity of the work. Then I did the difficult thing. I named the practical changes that would bite, not in show, but in the slow machinery of consequence. I have withdrawn my personal guarantee from the line of credit, I said. The bank will review terms accordingly. We will honor our obligations, as we always have. We will do it with clear roles and clear credit. I stated it plainly. It was neither a threat nor a plea. I am old enough to trust that clarity is an adult kindness, even when it tightens throats. I did not look at Ethan, but I felt the heat of his attention on my shoulder. The room listened the way fields listen right before the first cut in summer, still not unkind, ready to change shape. I closed my folder. "Thank you," I said. "Enjoy the coffee. It smells better than most truths." I stepped back. The MC took the microphone and said something about gratitude. There was a genteel scramble while someone advanced the slideshow past the offending slide. A volunteer added a plate of muffins to the table with such concentration you would think pastry could heal signage. Slowly, the room found its next conversation. Not the same conversation it would have had if I had said nothing. A different one. That was enough. After the formal part, people came to me in ones and twos. A client of long standing shook my hand longer than necessary and said with quiet emphasis, "Thank you for saying what you said. Foundations matter." A supplier nodded and told me he'd already seen the board notice from the bank and that he respected it. He used the word prudence, which is not fashionable and therefore perfect. The mayor's assistant wrote something in her notebook while looking at me as if the sentence would come out better if she squinted correctly. Ethan and his wife approached together. He looked tired around the eyes in the way a person does when an easy story has put its weight down. She held the clipboard like a shield, and then, realizing it looked that way, lowered it to her side. "We should have gotten the wording right," Ethan said. "I'm sorry for that." This is not the same as being sorry for the impulse behind the wording, but it is a start. I nodded. "We will correct it," he added. "We'll issue a statement tomorrow." I nodded again. I did not rescue him by making it easier than it needed to be. Silence is not a punishment, but it can be persuasive. The rest of the evening was the tidy chaos of such events. Mismatched conversations, a child darting under a chair where he wasn't supposed to be, the coffee urn needing a refill at the exact moment 3 people wanted a top-up. I stayed long enough to be seen and short enough to avoid offering to stack chairs. As I pulled on my coat, a younger employee I didn't know well stopped me and said, "I didn't know. I should have guessed. Thank you for anchoring it." Anchoring. The word lodged somewhere useful. Outside, the cold felt lighter, as if the air had made space for breath. I drove home the long way past the old office over the hardware store. The windows were dark, but the electric sign in the pharmacy beside it still flickered, the same 2 letters it has been flickering since before my children were born. In a town like ours, small failures persist as surely as small triumphs. Both are a kind of continuity. The next morning, the statement went out. It was simple and unadorned. A correction to the founding attribution, a sentence recognizing my role formally and without the pained grin of reluctant grace. The bank sent a note acknowledging receipt of the updated documents and advising that an account review would be scheduled. The accountant copied me on a reply to a reporter who had sent questions late in the night. His answer was factual, without sugar. The world did not tilt, but something inside our world did. Corrections have a way of asking people to stand up a little straighter, even if no one applauds. There were consequences, as there always are when you move a line back to where it belongs. A client who had been courted aggressively by Ethan, someone from out of town who prefers polish to provenance, postponed a contract meeting pending internal review. A supplier called to confirm delivery but adjusted terms by a week until the bank finalized the credit line without my guarantee. None of this surprised me. This is how larger systems speak when someone shifts the weight inside them. I use the week to check inventory and revise a work schedule the old-fashioned way, on paper, which will not crash while you are still thinking. At home, the change was subtler and more personal. The house felt the same underfoot. The cedar bowl sat in its place as if it had never been asked to learn a new home. But my evenings took on a spacing I had not known before. Without the constant background tug of being on call for a story I was no longer allowed to narrate, I slept the kind of sleep people pay money to imitate with white noise machines. I began to read the newspaper with a pencil in hand again, not to solve anyone's problems, but to underline words worth remembering. The word prudence appeared twice in a week, and I underlined it both times. Ethan came by Sunday afternoon. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets like a boy who has done something wrong and is still deciding how much of it to admit to. I let him in. The house met him with the same smells and creaks that raised him, indifferent to the storm he had set out into the world. He sat at the table, and I set down a mug. He did not wrap his hands around it right away, which told me he had rehearsed this talk somewhere less warm. I started down the steps, careful on the last one where the grain raises in the cold. Ethan came by Sunday afternoon. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets like a boy who has done something wrong and is still deciding how much of it to admit to. I let him in. The house met him with the same smells and creaks that raised him, indifferent to the storm he had set out into the world. He sat at the table and I set down a mug. He did not wrap his hands around it right away, which told me he had rehearsed this talk somewhere less warm. "I've made calls," he said, looking at the steam, not me. "We've updated the site and the banner will be redone. I told the team we'd speak about the way we talk about history." He paused, measuring whether he was asking for praise. I did not give any. He added quieter, "I'm not proud of how we got here." "I am not proud either," I said, and watched the sentence find its place in the room. "But pride is a flimsy scaffolding. We will use different materials." He nodded. We sat in something else for a minute, something that was not forgiveness yet, but was certainly the space where forgiveness could be built. He asked about the bank, and I told him the review would be fine if he remembered that numbers are not the enemy. Performance is. He smiled in that rueful way people do when the advice they receive was the lesson they set out to avoid. "I keep thinking," he said eventually, "about the first winter after Dad." He stopped, stood up, and looked out the window at the lilac that had made a good show of pretending dead all winter. "You didn't make a speech. You just kept us fed." I thought of the tins of soup I had lined up like soldiers against a siege. I did not say that keeping everyone fed had sometimes meant eating last. Some confessions are for the person who made them, not for the ones who benefited. We did not hug. I sent him home with a jar of stew because cooking is a muscle memory that outlasts any rewrite. On the way out, he paused at the door and said, "I'll try to do right by the name." He meant the business name. I heard something else, too. When the door shut, the house exhaled in the old way. In the days that followed, there were calls from people who wanted the soft version of what happened, the version where no one is wrong and the story resolves into a moral that fits on a coaster. I answered with as much gentleness as precision allowed. I did not trade in gossip. I did not pretend endings immediately teach their lessons. If I could pass along anything useful, it was only this. Families and businesses require the same two things, truth and repair. If you neglect either, eventually the floor sinks under the chair you were sure would hold. One quiet night, when the wind had stilled and the temperature dropped hard, I climbed the stairs and paused on the landing, the way I have every night since I learned how to listen to a house. Below me, the pines sighed. From the kitchen, an honest drip reminded me to tighten the cold water valve in the morning. I thought, not of banners or banks, but of the smallest real consequence of the past weeks, the space that has opened in me where panic used to sit. It is not a triumphant space. It has no appetite for trumpets. It is a clearing. I can stand in it and see a little farther than I could before. I'm not naive. I know there are dues to pay for choosing dignity over quiet. Some people will decide I am difficult now that I refuse to be misnamed. Some will admire the firmness and keep their distance anyway, because firmness frightens them. It reminds them of their own soft spots. Ethan will revert to habit some days, as I will. We will both need to be corrected by our better selves. His wife will learn that keeping a room neat is not the same as keeping its narrative honest. She may decide one day that she prefers the latter. I hope she does. She is capable of detail. Detail is the path to truth. As for the business, it will dock its boats where weather and choices permit. There will be months that glow and months that sulk. There will be orders that thrill and orders that barely break even. If it continues, it will do so on the simple strength of work done well and accounts kept straight. If it falters, it will not be because the founder insisted on being named. It will be because the market is the market and winter is winter. Blame, like pride, is a poor foreman. Results are better. It would be tempting to say that the party ended with a final applause and a clean moral. But the party ended as they all do in real life. Coats lifted from a rack with stray gloves in their sleeves, a dropped napkin under a chair, someone's laughter hanging in the air just a little too long, and then the quiet of an empty room. The caretakers came with their mops. The banner was rolled with careful hands and leaned against a wall. The floor cooled. In the parking lot, people turned their keys and checked their mirrors, and the small beams of their headlights made cones in the cold. On the drive home, I caught a patch of black ice and corrected with the gentle hands of a person who does not overreact. The car straightened, and so did I. If I have anything like a conclusion to offer, it is this. There is no revenge that tastes as clean as the taste of your own name restored to the sentence where it belongs. I did not humiliate my son. Humiliation is a poor teacher. I corrected him in public because the error was public. I pulled back my guarantee because it was time he walked on his own legs. I kept the door hinged and the light on. He can choose, as we all can, whether to step back inside with better language in his mouth. People like to think that families either hold or break. The truth is quieter. Families adjust. Sometimes the adjustment looks like a dinner, sometimes like a meeting, sometimes like a mother standing at a podium with a folder in her hand. Repair is not affection, it is action. Affection can return when the edges are true. That is, finally, the work I have chosen, to keep my edges true and to leave room at the table I built for anyone willing to call the furniture by its right name. As for me, I will keep the habits that saved me when applause was nowhere to be found. Shovel the hydrant, salt the steps, roll a towel against the draft, keep the papers in order, brew tea when the day asks more than I expected to give it. In June, the lilac will return without apology, and so will I, older by one winter, and if I am lucky, lighter by one needless worry. The house will creak where it always has. I will answer it with the small repairs that add up to living. If anyone wonders who built the family they now inhabit, who washed the cups and paid the invoices and signed the first papers so there was a door to argue about in the first place, I will not lift a banner. I will open the file drawer. I will set down the bowl. I will speak. And if I am ever tempted to forget the plain mercy of a corrected record, I will walk to the community center on an evening when the kids skate. I will sit in the stands with my coat on and my mittens stacked on my lap. I will watch them push off and turn, clumsy, then smoother, until the motion proves itself. Every circle ends where it began, and still the skater has gone somewhere. That is the shape of it. That is the lesson I claim.